I could see quite plainly in mid-air a strange light which seemed to be quite distinctly outlined, and was not a reflection of the moon, nor were there any clouds in the neighbourhood. The light became brighter, and I could see quite distinctly 3 shapes, one in the centre having what looked like outspread wings. The other 2 were not so large, but were quite plainly distinct from the centre one. They appeared to have a long, loose-hanging garment of a golden tint, and they were above the German line facing us. We stood watching them for about 3/4 of an hour. All the men with me saw them, and other men came up from other groups who also told us that they had seen the same thing. I am not a believer in such things, but I have not the slightest doubt that we really did see what I now tell you. That was how an unnamed lance corporal described the appearance of the Angels of Mons to his nurse, as reported by Harold Begbie in his book On the Side of the Angels in 1915. The story of the Angel or Angels of Mons is a well-known First World War tale about angels or possibly bowmen appearing to British soldiers in the middle of a disastrous retreat very early in the war.
If you've ever looked up the story of the Angel at Mons, you've probably seen that it was inspired by a short story by Arthur Machen that appeared in the London Evening News. But was it? Arthur Machen's short story was about medieval bowmen. How did medieval bowmen turn into an angel? Let's find out. If you're new here, hi, I'm Juliet. I'm a writer and historian, and on this channel I cover myth, legend, folklore, ghost stories, and weird and wonderful history in general. A quick note, I did see several little tiny inconsistencies between various secondary sources when I was putting this together. I have tried to go for what I think is the most accurate in each case, but if you spot any tiny errors or inconsistencies, let me know in the comments. It will be because I had 2 contradictory sources and could not work out which one was more accurate. The Battle of Mons was the first major engagement for the British Expeditionary Force in the First World War. Quick recap, the First World War, or the Great War as it was known at the time, was fought 1914 to 1918. It was triggered by the assassination of the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie, by a teenager called Gavrilo Princip in Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914. This kicked off a series of declarations of war from the 28th of July onwards, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Because so many European countries were allied with each other in 2 opposing alliances, this brought about war between the whole of Europe. Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August, but had been aware that war was coming for several weeks before that. The Battle of Mons was fought at Mons in Belgium, 23rd to 24th of August 1914. This took place before the trench warfare that would define the Western Front had really dug in, no horrible pun intended. At this point, the British Expeditionary Force, who had only just got out there, were composed mainly of career soldiers and men who were already in the army when the war broke out, along with long-standing volunteers and reservists. The British were outnumbered by about 3 to 1 by the Germans, and they were forced to retreat, a process which took about 2 weeks, but there was especially hard marching between the 23rd and 26th of August. On the 29th of September 1914, a short story called The Bowmen by Arthur Machen was published in the London Evening News. Machen wrote both journalistic pieces and short stories for the paper, and this one was not clearly labelled as fiction. In the story, a soldier at the Battle of Mons, which had taken place about a month before, prays to St. George at the darkest moment of the battle. I'm going to read a short section from the story. Please note the archaic use of the word queer to mean strange rather than anything to do with LGBTQ+, and also Machen is a little bit rude about vegetarianism. These are the attitudes of 1914 coming through here. "World without end, amen," said one of the British soldiers with some irrelevance as he took aim and fired. And then he remembered, he says he cannot think why or wherefore, a queer vegetarian restaurant in London, where he had once or twice eaten eccentric dishes of cutlets made of lentils and nuts that pretended to be steak. On all the plates in this restaurant there was printed a figure of St. George in blue, with the motto Adsit Anglis Sanctus Georgius. May St. George be a present help to the English. The soldier happened to know Latin and other useless things, and now, as he fired at his man in the grey advancing mass 300 yards away, he uttered the pious vegetarian motto. As the Latin scholar uttered his invocation, he felt something between a shudder and an electric shock pass through his body. The roar of the battle died down in his ears to a gentle murmur. Instead of it, he says, he heard a great voice and a shout louder than a thunder peal crying, "Array! Array! Array!" His heart grew hot as a burning coal. It grew cold as ice within him, as it seemed to him that a tumult of voices answered his summons. He heard, or seemed to hear, thousands shouting, "St. George! St. George!" Ha, Messiah! Ha, sweet saint, grant us good deliverance! St. George for merry England! Harrow, harrow, Monsignor St. George, succour us! Ha, St. George! Ha, St. George! A long bow and a strong bow! Heaven's knight aid us! And as the soldier heard these voices, he saw before him, beyond the trench, a long line of shapes with a shining about them. They were like men who drew the bow, and with another shout their cloud of arrows flew singing and tingling through the air towards the German hosts. The man who knew what nuts tasted like when they called themselves steak knew also that St. George had brought his Agincourt bowmen to help the English. So in this fictional short story, the bowmen from the Battle of Agincourt, a medieval battle fought between the English and the French, came to help the English against the Germans in the 1914 Battle of Mons. Agincourt was one of many battles in the 100 Years' War fought between England and France between 1337 and 1453. As you can tell, it's actually slightly more than 100 years. The war had been kicked off because in 1328, Charles IV of France died without sons or brothers, and his nephew Edward III was King of England. French barons did not want an English rule, so the dispute over the succession to the French throne continued for many generations, way beyond the reign of Edward III. The Battle of Agincourt was an English victory on St. Crispin's Day, the 25th of October, 1415. By the time of the Battle of Agincourt, English numbers were low, and many men on the campaign had died of disease already. But Agincourt was a victory despite the odds, and a high point for England in a campaign that had not gone very well up to that point. About 80% of King Henry V of England's army were English and Welsh longbowmen. Henry V led the army himself. His opponent, Charles VI of France, was unable to do so because he was mentally ill. So that plays into the English propaganda as well, that the English king is in the battle with his troops. Henry also massacred French prisoners afterwards. We are predating the Geneva Convention by quite some years here. The battle is especially famous because it was dramatised by William Shakespeare in his play Henry V. This play and this battle are the origins of the famous St. Crispin's Day speech. That's the speech with the line, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." It also features the "once more unto the breach" speech, which also relates to the Battle of Agincourt. There is a breach in the French wall, a hole, and the English, who are vastly outnumbered by the French, are piling into the breach to fight. And this is where we get the famous lines, "Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. The game's afoot, follow your spirit, and upon this charge, cry God for Harry, England, and St. George." There was also a tradition around this battle that St. George had been seen during the fight, riding in the sky above the English. So this was very, very well known to anybody with any knowledge of English literature, and the play Henry V and the depiction of the Battle of Agincourt are frequently used for British propaganda and continue to be so well into World War II, much later on when Laurence Olivier starred in a film production of it during World War II. Machen was well read, and there are plenty of influences on the bowmen, but it's pretty clear that this is core to it. The Shakespeare play, the idea of St. George at Agincourt, and then the idea of maybe St. George and the bowmen from Agincourt turning up as ghosts to help the English fight the Germans at Mons. And this is why many people, including Machen himself, believe that there is no more to the story of the Angel at Mons than people taking this story that Machen wrote, not realising it was fiction, and running with it. But Machen did not write about angels. He didn't write about mysterious clouds either, which also crop up in several reports from this battle. Machen wrote about bowmen and St. George. So where do the angels come from? Machen's story came out on the 29th of September 1914. A diary entry written by Brigadier General John Charteris and dated the 5th of September 1914 says, "Then there is the story of the Angel of Mons going strong through the Second Corps, of how the Angel of the Lord on the traditional white horse and clad all in white with flaming sword faced the advancing Germans at Mons and forbade their further progress. Men's nerves and imagination play weird pranks in these strenuous times. All the same, the Angel at Mons interests me. I cannot find out how the legend arose." In another diary entry on the 11th of February 1915, Charteris wrote, "The impossibility of answering those whys as regards the Germans are explained in the easy philosophy of the men by the Angel of Mons theory, of which I told you when I was at home. I have been at some trouble to trace the rumour to its source. The best I can make of it is that some religiously minded man wrote home that the Germans halted at Mons as if an angel of the Lord had appeared in front of them. In due course, the letter appeared in a parish magazine, which in time was sent out to some other men at the front. From them, the story went back home with the as if omitted, and at home it went the rounds in its expurgated form." So we can see here that Charteris does not believe there was actually an angel at Mons. He thinks that it's the result of men's nerves and imagination playing weird pranks on them, and he's trying to trace the source of the story. But if we assume that these diary entries are accurate, the story was clearly going around before Machen's story was published. Folklorist David Clarke has argued that these diary entries were actually written in 1931, when the diary was published, obviously between the wars and much later, rather than the dates that are put on them of the 5th of September 1914 and the 11th of February 1915. This is because of the reference Charteris makes to a parish magazine in the 1915 entry, which Clarke assumes must refer to a magazine article published by All Saints at Clifton in Bristol in April 1915. Clarke basically assumes there's one parish magazine article specifically that's very well known that tells this story. That must be what Charteris is referring to, and since it came out in April, the diary entry for February must be faked. Honestly, this seems kind of baffling to me. I don't quite understand why a brigadier general in the 1930s would want to fake a story relating to a battle from 1914. If it was during the war, then maybe he would be trying to improve morale or something, but this is between the wars, 1931. It's a very well-known story by the time we get to 1931, and not to disparage Clarke's research, because I'm sure it was very thorough, but I'm not sure he can definitively say that he definitely checked every single parish magazine from all of England between September 1914 and April 1915, because at that time there would have been a heck of a lot of those, and some of them may not have been preserved. I don't think Clarke is deliberately doing a bad job or anything, I just think you can't possibly know for certain that you've seen all of them. Jacqueline Simpson has pointed out we don't know that Charteris is referring to the specific magazine from Bristol that is so well known, and there's just no reason to think he's faking his diary entries by the time he publishes them in 1931. Clarke said that the earliest reference he could find to an angel or angels at Mons was from the 3rd of April 1915, so still after the February diary entry, but before the Bristol magazine that he thought must be the one that Charteris was referring to. 3rd of April 1915, the Hereford Times published an article called A Troop of Angels. It reported that a Hereford clergyman had received a letter from a relative who said they had met with a Miss Marrable, daughter of the well-known Canon Marrable, who said that she knew 2 officers who had seen the angels who saved the left wing from the Germans when they came right upon them during our retreat from Mons. So obviously this story is, 4th, 5th, 6th hand? You can certainly see a folkloric legend in development. It's passed through half a dozen people already. But the point is, it is about angels, it's not about bowmen. It does not predate Machen's story, but it does predate some of the best known versions of the story of the Angel at Mons that came up later in April and May 1915. According to Miss Marrable, one of the officers told her he saw a troop of angels between us and the enemy, and he claimed he had slightly changed his sceptical religious attitude as a result. The other officer, when she met him and asked if he had heard of the wonderful stories of angels, said he had seen them himself. The next reference to the angels that Clarke reports is from the 24th of April 1915, when spiritualist magazine Light referred to Machen's story specifically as well as the rumours. So they've seen Machen's story in the newspaper, but they've also heard rumours about the angels. And remember, Machen's story is about bowmen and St. George, not angels. Light said that a military officer had got in touch and said that whether Mr. Machen's story was pure invention or not, it was certainly stated in some quarters that a curious phenomenon had been witnessed by several officers and men in connection with the retreat from Mons. It took the form of a strange cloud interposed between the Germans and the British. Other wonders were heard or seen in connection with this cloud, which it seems had the effect of protecting the British against the overwhelming hordes of the enemy. So now we haven't got angels or bowmen or St. George, we've got a cloud. And again, this seems like a rumour that is genuinely going around the forces, and doesn't really sound much like Machen's story at all, other than that there's some mysterious force protecting the British during the retreat from Mons. The first version Clarke mentions that seems to actually replicate Machen's fictional story appeared in the Catholic newspaper The Universe on the 15th of May 1915, which claimed to report a letter sent home by an officer who was at Mons, who claimed that the men yelled, "St. George for England!" as they attacked, and became aware of men with bows and arrows going with them, and a German claimed to have seen an officer on a great white horse leading them. Now that sounds like Machen's story. That's got that almost Shakespearean quote, reference to Agincourt and Henry V and so on. It's got St. George, it's got bows and arrows, that one sounds like it is somebody who has mistaken Machen's story for truth. From this point on, the rumours and the versions spread and multiply. Some directly replicate bits of Machen's story, others report stories of angels or of a cloud or light. Just to go over a few of the best known, the parish magazine that Clarke was absolutely convinced Charteris must be referring to was the parish magazine of All Saints Church in Clifton in Bristol, which on the 14th of May 1915 more or less replicated the report from Miss Marrable from the Hereford Times that had appeared on the 3rd of April. Although this one embellishes a little bit and it seems to have taken off more. The one from the Hereford Times doesn't seem to be quite so well known, although it seems to be the original, possibly. This one seems to replicate and embellish it, and then it just really took off in popularity and became quite well known. Also in May 1915, A.P. Sinnett in the Occult Review referred to those who saw a row of shining beings between the two armies. And that seems to blend the two. We've got shining beings, which seems to imply angels, but picks up on Machen's use of the word shining to describe the bowmen. A 1915 book that came out a little bit later, On the Side of the Angels, a reply to Arthur Machen by Harold Begbie, saw Begbie argue that Machen, who had written the story after reading what he called an awful account of the retreat from Mons, had been unconsciously influenced by a reference to a real event that he'd then forgotten about in its details. Perhaps less convincingly, Begbie also suggested he might have been telepathically influenced by the experiences of soldiers from the event. Begbie's book did include some inaccuracies that had to be amended in the second edition, which obviously hurt its credibility quite a bit. And then on the much less credible front, another 1915 book, a memoir by Phyllis Campbell, who was a nurse at the front, called Back to the Front: Experiences of a Nurse, mentioned the stories as well. Campbell was a writer for the Occult Review, and she also later wrote 2 Mills and Boon novels. Mills and Boon published paperback romances in the UK. I assume they're still going. They were huge when I was growing up. There'd be shelves of them in the bookshops. Campbell described soldiers she was treating from Mons as having an exalted look and talking about St. George on a white horse. But Campbell also included completely false accusations of war crimes against the Germans. She has this horrendous kind of hatred of the Germans that is not justified by actual historical fact. And records from other nurses who also treated soldiers at Mons do not corroborate her story. And you'll notice her story is all about St. George. So that does appear to be a version of Machen's story again. There are very few eyewitness accounts from Mons. The battle took place very early in the war. It was a bad defeat for the English, so many of them died anyway, and of those who survived, many of them were killed in the next 4 years of war, just because it took place so early on in the conflict. But there is one eyewitness who doesn't report seeing angels, but does, like Charteris, provide a possible explanation for people seeing something. Frank Richards was a private and a reservist who survived the war and later wrote the Billy Bunting books, and he also wrote his own autobiography. In his autobiography, he says, "If any angels were seen on the retirement, as the newspaper accounts said they were seen that night," which is August the 26th. March, march, for hour after hour without a halt. We were now breaking into the 5th day of continuous marching with practically no sleep in between. Stevens said, "That's a fine castle there, see?" pointing to one side of the road. But there was nothing there. Very nearly everyone was seeing things. We were all so dead beat. So Richards hasn't seen anything himself. No angels, cloud, light, bowmen, or St. George. But he does say that people were seeing things that night. And he very clearly states that it's hallucinations. It's people who are just massively sleep deprived and are seeing things as they march, completely exhausted. But that would certainly provide an explanation, and it also suggests that Machen's story is not the only source necessarily. He specifically mentions his friend Stephen seeing a castle. Now that doesn't make it into any of the specific stories about Mons, but it certainly implies that people may have seen strange things that night as a result of exhaustion, and that those rumours could have blended together with Machen's story, but that would also explain why Machen's story is not the only form that they appear. This could be where the angels come from. Arthur Machen himself was absolutely convinced that his story was the source of the story of the angels at Mons. He was quite spiritual himself, and he actually had the idea for the story while he was in church, not listening to the sermon, but he genuinely believed that the whole thing was a misunderstanding, that people had mistaken his story for fact because it wasn't clearly labelled as fiction, and he really wanted to set the record straight. The story was published in a book in August 1915, and he wrote an introduction and a postscript for it to try and clear things up. He said that a few days after the story was published, the editor of the Occult Review wrote to him to ask if it had any basis in truth, and he wrote back and said no. The editor of Light wrote to him a few days after that, and he also said no. Then he says, a month or two later, I received several requests from editors of parish magazines to reprint the story. I, or rather my editor, readily gave permission, and then, after a month or two, the conductor of one of these magazines wrote to me saying that the February issue containing the story had been sold out, while there was still a great demand for it. One thing that's very interesting about that is that he mentions multiple parish magazines already asking him for the story and reprinting it by February, which suggests that Charteris really was referring to a magazine from January or February that clearly just hasn't survived for Clarke to be able to find. But it really was being reported in parish magazines. Charteris isn't doctoring his diary entries. Machen was horrified to find a priest who wrote to him asking to reprint the story was absolutely convinced it was true, even when he said it wasn't. This was around April 1915. He also saw several versions that mentioned a vegetarian restaurant that were clearly drawn from his story, and a lot of versions heavily featuring St. George. So anything with a vegetarian restaurant, I mean, it would be an extraordinary coincidence if one of the soldiers had hallucinated a vegetarian restaurant, especially when vegetarianism was pretty niche in 1914. So again, we assume anything with vegetarian restaurants, heavy references to St. George and Bowmen, is probably derived from Machen's story. But there are other versions too. Machen himself said, other versions of the story appeared in which a cloud interposed between the attacking Germans and the defending British. St. George, it will be noted, has disappeared. He persisted some time longer in certain Roman Catholic variants, and there are no more bowmen, no more arrows. But so far angels are not mentioned. Yet they are ready to appear, and I think that I have detected the machine which brought them into the story. In the bowmen, my imagined soldier saw a long line of shapes with a shining about them, and Mr. A.P. Sinnott, writing in the May issue of the Occult Review, states that those who could see said they saw a row of shining beings between the two armies. Now I conjecture that the word shining is the link between my tale and the derivative from it. In the popular view, shining and benevolent supernatural beings are angels and nothing else, and must be angels. And so I believe the bowmen of my story have become the Angels of Mons. He was also extremely unconvinced by Harold Begbie's argument. In a 1918 letter to Vincent Starrett, he said, I don't think anything about Harold Begbie or his books. On the side of the Angels was a publisher's commission. I don't think that Harold believes in a word of it. I don't think he's fool enough to do so. Machen's explanation does make some kind of sense, although it's a bit of a stretch from shining bowmen and St. George to angels and a cloud. Not really the same thing, but I can see his way of thinking. What he didn't know, of course, was that there was that diary entry from Charteris saying that there were already rumours about an angel appearing going around on the 5th of September. Machen didn't know that. Charteris's diaries weren't published until 1931. He had no way of knowing that, so of course he assumed his story was the source of everything. As the war went on, there were plenty more stories to come about angels, religious visions of a white helper identified with Jesus, visions, all sorts of things from other battles throughout the war. And again, there's no need to assume that everybody is always lying. One thing that people would not have known much about at this time is what we sometimes call the third man factor, or sensed presence, where people in extreme situations and in danger for their lives quite often experience the feeling of somebody near them or even hear somebody talking to them. This became well known by the general public in 1919 when Ernest Shackleton wrote about his experience of it during his 1914 to 1917 Antarctic expedition that went very wrong, but that everybody managed to survive except the cat. I always mention that the poor cat didn't make it. Obviously, Shackleton hadn't even had that experience when Mons happened, but it is a recurring human phenomenon. There are lots and lots of examples of sensed presence and reports of sensed presence or third man factor. So it's very, very possible that lots of people in World War I had the feeling of seeing someone, feeling someone near them, hearing a voice, and they may have interpreted that as an angel or St. George or Jesus, or interpret it in all sorts of ways. There are lots of different explanations for sensed presence itself. Some are scientific, some are spiritual, and nobody can say for sure which or both or any are accurate. Stories of legendary helpers in war are also extremely common throughout history. They go back at least as far as ancient Greece. There are reports from battles from the classical Greek period of Trojan heroes from several hundred years earlier appearing in the battle to help the soldiers. So the idea of somebody from that place's history coming and helping, a hero from history helping current soldiers, is a very, very old idea indeed. And Arthur Machen, I'm sure, had read his Herodotus and knew that when he wrote his story. For me, I think it seems clear that the versions of the story that have St. George and the Bowmen in them are probably just Machen's story that people have not realised was fiction. But I just don't think that explains the cloud and the angels. They're quite different. The argument that the entire story comes only from Machen's story and nothing else does assume that a lot of people are lying. Now, some of them I think are lying, but not all of them. I can't see any reason Charteris would be lying. And he talks about rumours going around the men. I also can't help thinking of other times when historians have disbelieved people for years or even centuries. For example, Pliny the Younger described the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that took place in AD 79, and he described it accurately. Because it was a pyroclastic flow and not a classic lava flow, for centuries he was disbelieved and people thought he'd got it wrong until we saw some pyroclastic flow eruptions and realised he'd described it quite accurately. When the Titanic sank, some third-class passengers and lower-ranked members of the crew said that they had seen the ship break in half. But Second Officer Lightoller, possibly wanting to protect his company, the White Star Line, said that it had not, that it had stayed in one piece as it went down. And that's what people believed until the 1980s when they found it on the bottom of the ocean in two pieces. So I think there is a tendency to not believe people very easily, to just be like, nothing's reliable, this isn't reliable, this isn't reliable, this isn't reliable, we can't believe anything. And when you've got Machen's fictional story and this tendency to disbelieve, and especially a somewhat classist tendency to disbelieve people who are not elite, you get the assumption that the story is entirely fake. Now, I'm not arguing that it was definitely angels. I am a religious person myself, I won't rule it out, but equally it could be weird weather conditions, some kind of weird light effect, even more likely, as Richards and Charteris thought, just hallucinations. And once one person says, I think I can see a weird cloud, other people start seeing a weird cloud or an angel or whatever they see. So I'm not saying it has to be angels, but I don't think the entire story comes completely from Machen's story. I think there is a weird coincidence, or as Begbie suggested, not the telepathy thing, but maybe Machen did read something about people seeing something that he then forgot about that fed into his subconscious. Or it's just a coincidence. Machen is drawing on a literary tradition about earlier heroes helping out soldiers in battle, and it just happens that soldiers have also genuinely seen something quite different but weird, possibly even just a cloud, and then the two get conflated. And then the story really takes off when the two get conflated, and some versions are reporting Machen's fictional story, and some versions are reporting things people genuinely believe they have seen, and everything gets mixed up together. I just don't think Machen's bowmen magically turned into angels. I think there was something genuinely weird, even if it was only in people's minds. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. And if you fancy a bit of a historical ghost story, pick up my book, Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Rome, which retells 13 ancient Roman ghost stories, 2 of them by Pliny the Younger, he who was disbelieved about Mount Vesuvius. See if you believe him anymore when it comes to the ghost stories. Subscribe to my channel for myth, legend, folklore, ghost stories, and weird and wonderful history in general. And until next time, bye! Come on, Freba.